Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Harley Dickinson. I'm the Vice Dean of Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Science at the University of Saskatchewan, and it's been my great pleasure and privilege this year to also be the chair of the Whelen Lecture Planning Committee. I've got a very pleasant and brief task, which is to welcome you all here and to provide a little bit of information about the evening's events. First off, after the lecture, Raj Patel has agreed to take a few questions, so be prepared for that. You'll notice that there's microphones about the middle of each aisle, and please go to those mics to ask your questions. He's also agreed to do some book signing after the lecture, so at the back there's a University of Saskatchewan bookstore table, and if you'd like signed books, that's the place to go. There's also a reception here this evening, and I invite all of you to attend that after the lecture. And I'd like to let you know also that tonight's event is being streamed live through the CCDE, the Center for Continuing and Distance Education on campus. The URL is ccde.usask.ca if you're interested in seeing that. And it's also being recorded by CBC. So it's a big event, a high event on the university's calendar, and as again, I'm really pleased to welcome you on behalf of the university, and I'd like to introduce now Brett Fairbairn, Provost and Vice President Academic from the University of Saskatchewan.
Well, good evening, everyone. As Harley mentioned, my name is Brett Fairbairn, and on behalf of the University of Saskatchewan, welcome to the 2011 Whelen Lecture. The Whelen Lecture Series was established in 1986 with the bequest of Dr. Myron Whelen, a distinguished alumnus from the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Whelen grew up in a small farming community in Saskatchewan where his family settled in 1907. And where there was limited opportunity for people to interact with scientists, artists, or public intellectuals. He studied chemistry at the University of Saskatchewan in the 1920s and went on to a professional career with the DuPont Corporation. His intent for the lecture series was for the university to invite academics and specialists of international reputation in subject areas that would appeal to a broad spectrum of the public. Our topic tonight is as universal a human concern as any could be, namely food, food systems, and how to feed the world. Now, where in the world would be a better place for a conversation about food than Saskatchewan? This is the province that has 43% of the arable land of the second largest country on earth. This land sustained First Nations people for millennia and was settled barely a century ago with a mission to feed the world. Saskatchewan has always been among the provinces most dependent on global trade. Producers here have grappled continuously with markets, with or without the wheat board. And if Saskatchewan is the place, then this is also the time to hear from Raj Patel. We're entering the fourth year of global uncertainty and even turmoil in markets. We're entering the second month of a global movement to occupy Wall Street and to protest social and economic inequality. Incidentally, we do have a Wall Street in Saskatoon. I don't know if anyone has occupied it, but I could be wrong. In Saskatoon, instead of Wall Street, people have occupied Friendship Park. There's something very prairie about occupying Friendship Park. I'd like to think it symbolizes our communitarian ethos and shows that prairie people are never very far from the idea of the commons. But I digress. We are in a time of global uncertainty and discontent. People are primed as never in recent memory to think critically and skeptically about the institutions of our society. Enter Dr. Raj Patel. Academically trained at Oxford, London School of Economics, and Cornell, New York Times best-selling author, Raj Patel grew up in Golders Green in northwest London. He's a child of a mother from Kenya and a father from Fiji. From his parents' corner shop in London, where he worked as a child, he went on as part of his academic training to work for the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations. He's presently a visiting scholar at Berkeley's Center for African Studies and an Honorary Research Fellow for the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's Fellow at 2 global institutes, the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First, and the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Born of parents from Africa and the Pacific, growing up in Europe, educated at world-leading universities, having worked for as well as protested against key global institutions, attached today to universities on 2 continents, Raj Patel's is truly a biography of globalization. It is above all for his writing that Dr. Patel is known. In addition to numerous scholarly publications, he often writes for The Guardian, has contributed to the LA Times, NewYorkTimes.com, the San Francisco Chronicle, The Mail on Sunday, and The Observer. He's best known for his books, Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and his latest, The Value of Nothing. He's been called the rock star of social justice writing. Beginning with Oscar Wilde's observation that nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing, Dr. Patel has argued that price structures to allocate value within global food systems are misrepresentative, especially given the hidden ecological and social costs of food, land, and resources. Among other things, Patel is critical of the unbalanced behavior of what he calls artificial people, incorporated entities such as governments and corporations. And I wonder, perhaps also entities like the university and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He calls on the world's real people to check the appetites of institutions and instead to reassert a politics of value and the idea of the commons. A world of fewer free lunches, he writes, may have more genuine liberty. Tonight, Raj Patel will argue that humanity produces enough food to feed everyone on the planet, yet the world is disfigured by inequality. Today, 1.5 billion are overweight, 1 billion are hungry. By the end of the century, it's estimated that there will be 10 billion people in the world. How can the planet possibly sustain us? Please join me in extending a warm Saskatoon welcome to Raj Patel.
Oh, Lord. Thank you. Thank you so much. My goodness, there are a lot of you. First of all, thank you, Harley and Brett, and the University of Saskatchewan and the Whelen Lecture Committee for inviting me in a series where there, if you were looking at the screen there earlier on, lecturers far more illustrious and learned, and at least older than me. Now, I want to keep expectations low because although the lecture title is How to Feed the World, that's not really what I'm going to be spending the majority of my time talking about this evening. What I'd really like to do is help us understand the grammar of the idea of how we feed the world. Because it's only recently that we've been able to ask the question, how will we feed the world? Of being able to pose the question of, how, in 2100, when there are 10 billion people on Earth, how will we feed them all? It's historically very unusual to be able to pose a question in that way. And I mean, I grew up with it. One of the reasons that I'm interested in food and social justice is because when I was a lad, the famines in Ethiopia were big news, and we had in the United Kingdom and then in the United States, Live Aid. You'll remember Live Aid for the song, which had the words had the words "Feed the world, let them know it's Christmas time again." Again, the grammar of it. Back in the day, it seemed kind of an appealing thing to do. Yes, we must let Africans know that it's Christmas time. Someone should send them a postcard. But the idea of feeding the world historically is something that I do want to sort of unpick here. And for us to be able to think about feeding the world, a lot of conceptual sort of infrastructure needs to be in place first. Perhaps one of the greatest sort of ways in which that thinking is made possible for us are the systems of international trade that now bind the world together. And systems of international trade are historically very new. We are used now to global markets in wheat. We are encouraged to surrender our wheat producers not to the kind charity of the Wheat Board, but the loving embrace of the 4 corporations that run the global wheat market. But that wheat market historically is very new. The global market in wheat is, 140 years old. And it was brought about by the British, who designed it with some fairly self-interested ideas behind their construction of this global wheat market. They were interested in cheap wheat in order to feed the workers of the world who toiled then in the workshop of the world in Manchester and in Liverpool. And so the British government was very keen to find cheap wheat, and they found it in India. And India was, until the British came along, a very sort of feudal society, one in which landlords owned the land and peasants toiled upon it. Now, when the British came, they saw this feudal system, characterized by landlords expropriating the surplus that peasants produced. But in years where things were bad, peasants were given were taken care of. So when there was a drought, it was landlords' responsibility under feudalism to make sure that there was food available for peasants. So feudalism, an entirely reprehensible system, but it had within it what's called a moral economy. Now, with this moral economy, the British saw landlords giving food away for free, and they said, landlords, you don't want to be doing that. What you want to be doing is, in fact, joining us in a productive global market. And you will find that once you start buying labor and then remunerating your peasants, and once they start buying food, you will find that you'll produce far more food. And if you bring your wheat to market, we, the British, will buy it from you at top pound. Well, not top dollar, top pound. We will pay top pound for your food. And you will find that you'll produce more than ever before, and you'll make a lot of money. Win, win, win. And obviously the landlord said, no thanks. And the British said, no, we have guns. And so it was. It was a little more complicated than that, but through processes, through the violent imposition of global markets, the British, to some extent, didn't lie. As a result of these global impositions of market in wheat, India exported millions of tons of grain. Far more was produced in India than ever had been before in the grain basket in the Punjab. But when you introduce global markets in wheat, you introduce two very simple rules. The first rule is that if you have money, you get to eat. And this is what happened, where workers in Liverpool and Manchester were able to find their bread cheaply supplied by farmers and farm workers in Punjab. But the second rule when you introduce global markets is that if you have no money, you starve. And this was the corollary of the imposition of global markets. And Britain didn't go into India wanting to create famine. They thought that they were feeding the world. They came with cutting-edge economics about how comparative advantage would mean that India flourished and the United Kingdom would flourish too. And so I want to quote the historian Mike Davis, who says, look, although the British insisted that they had rescued India from timeless hunger, more than one official was jolted when Indian nationalists quoted from an 1878 study published in the prestigious Journal of the Statistical Society that contrasted 31 serious famines in the 120 years of British rule against only 17 recorded famines in the previous 2 millennia. Millions died not outside the modern world system, but in the very process of being dynamically conscripted into its economic and political structures. They died in the golden age of liberal capitalism. Now, the structures of international trade that the British created are once again with us, and they're certainly something to do with the current situation in which we find ourselves. But before we get to the present, I want to turn our attention not to the imperial sort of imposition and the imperial wars that created the trade system, but a more recent war in which hunger was fought for some very interesting reasons, and to which we are being encouraged right now to return. And what I want to talk about in the majority of this talk is the Green Revolution, a moment in time in the 20th century where we are told hunger was beaten back throughout the world, and to which we ought to return today if we are serious about feeding the world in the 21st century. Now, the argument I want to make is, in part, one that's been made by several scholars, by people like John H. Perkins, Eric Ross, and Nick Carruthers. But the argument is that the Green Revolution was really a creature of the Cold War. that it was designed not to feed the hungry per se, but designed to fight communism. Before I think that it's important to understand the Green Revolution so that we can actually take a step back and reconsider the solutions that are being offered us if we're interested in feeding the world tomorrow. So let's have a think about the Green Revolution. It's an odd term, the Green Revolution. Without any knowledge of history, we might think the Green Revolution is, all about sort of wind turbines and solar and tofu. But the Green Revolution was something rather different. I want to read to you the moment in which the term, the Green Revolution, was coined. The man who coined it was William S. Goud. He was head of the United States Agency for International Development. And in 1968, he was addressing the Society for International Development in Washington, D.C. And he was describing a system of fertilizer, irrigation, improved hybrid seeds, but also state support, marketing boards, credit, extension services. And he said that all of these things together in the field of agriculture contain the makings of a new revolution. It is not a violet-red revolution like that of the Soviets, nor is it a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it the Green Revolution. Now, this Green Revolution, again, very sort of consciously contrasted with the Soviet Revolution, very much contrasted with the Chinese Revolution, and very much contrasted with the sort of monarchical revolution of Iran, was designed, again, as a sort of bulwark against communism. And certainly, when William Goud was making his pronouncements, and since then, the figures that are used to support this Green Revolution, this idea that what we need to feed the world are fertilizer, irrigation, credit, agricultural support services, these figures are very impressive. Rice production in Indonesia, for example, increased by 275% between 1966 and the year 2000. Chile witnessed a 200 kilo per hectare per year growth in maize after it introduced its Green Revolution technologies. By the end of the 1990s, close to 75% of Asia's rice and half of the wheat in Africa, Latin America, and Asia were grown with these Green Revolution varieties. And so, while global population growth increased by 110% between 1950 and 1990, global cereal production way outstripped that. It rose by 174% over the same period. And so this is why the man who's termed the godfather of the Green Revolution was able to claim that to millions of unfortunates who have long lived in despair, the Green Revolution seemed like a miracle that has generated a new hope for the future. So let's have a look at the history of this Green Revolution. Conventional histories of the Green Revolution date it back to early 1941, when the Rockefeller Foundation sent a team to survey Mexican agriculture. And as a result of this, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Mexican government started the Mexican Agricultural Project. And they aimed to increase the amount of food being squeezed out of the land. And to this project in 1944, a young biologist who was working at DuPont, the man who endowed this lecture, working at DuPont, and his name was Norman Borlaug. Now, Borlaug was recognized very early on as a prodigious talent. DuPont wanted to keep him. They offered to double his salary in 1944 were he only to stay. But Borlaug was motivated by higher goals, and he wanted to feed the world. And to do that, he moved to Mexico, and he experimented prodigiously. He was involved in a range of very sophisticated experiments, and in fact, he ended up driving crops from the northern Mexico to southern Mexico in his truck, and doing all kinds of very exciting plant breeding activities in order to develop what, in 1954, he released to the world as a miracle wheat. Now, this wheat was spread by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations throughout the world in the 1950s and 1960s. USAID agreed to fund its distribution throughout the world late in the 1960s, and in 1970, Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's the standard history of the Green Revolution. But we need to ask a few more questions to understand it. First of all, why Mexico? And why then? Well, until late 1940, Mexico's president was a man called Lázaro Cárdenas. He was the left-wing architect of modern corporatism in Mexico. He was a man who instituted wide-ranging reforms, including land reform in Mexico. He also nationalized the assets of, he nationalized oil assets, including the assets of the Standard Oil Company. Now, those of you who know the Standard Oil Company, its descendants are still with us today. Chevron, for example, one of the largest fractions of the Standard Oil Company. Chevron was the Standard Oil Company of California. But the Standard Oil Company was the source of Rockefeller Foundation money. And in 1940, Lázaro Cárdenas lost the election to a right-winger, a man called Avila Camacho, who, while consolidating some of Cárdenas's change, also signaled his class bias by instituting electoral reform to prevent communists from running in elections. Now, right here at the outset is something I want to flag. What we'll see in the context and the history of the Green Revolution is that it's about a class struggle. I know it's very unfashionable to talk about class struggle, but the Green Revolution has it at its core, and we should observe that in the Rockefeller Foundation's motivation for going to Mexico, what we see is the Rockefeller Foundation very interested in preventing the nationalization of, further nationalization of its assets elsewhere, but also seeing what it might do to be able to prevent and consolidate land, prevent land reform happening elsewhere as well. And this is the sort of interesting twist, that there's a logic that may not seem apparent that connects creating more food to fighting communism. I mean, initially, of course, it makes very little sense. I mean, how does growing more wheat